is going to be on making the presidency safe and effective. And really, the focus of this lecture is going to be mainly on ways that we kind of limit the power of the president. But we're going to start with seeing why the president has so much power. And basically, when we read the Constitution grants him a lot of powers because it's not really specific. We tell him he's commander in chief and he is the chief executive and he gets to veto laws and sign laws. But after that, it's kind of vague on what he can do and not do. So what we've seen over time is that, especially in times of emergency, the president's power grows dramatically. For example, after the attacks of September 11th, the U.S. government and Congress passed the Patriot Act. President Bush signed it into law. One of the pieces in the Patriot Act talked about the ability of a group to be able, they're called FISA courts, FISA, to be able to determine whether or not the National Security Agency would be able to do what are called warrantless wiretaps. Now, we've studied the Bill of Rights, and in the Fourth Amendment specifically, it talks about if a search is going to be conducted, it has to be based upon probable cause that a crime has been committed. And a search includes listening in on your conversations. But after September 11th, the Patriot Act was passed by Congress and signed by the president. And today, based on the law, based on court interpretation, courts have affirmed that it is perfectly legal to have a wiretap without a warrant. That is a big change from what historically people would have thought. So when we look at the power of the president, we tend to see that during times of crisis, it can grow. In normal times, the president really has to deal with checks and balances. And we're going to see this in the next 2 years with President Obama. He's going to have a Republican House, a Republican Senate. They're going to send him legislation. I will be surprised if he agrees with most of it. So he'll probably veto a lot of the legislation. And there we go, checks and balances. One of the problems that we, the people, deal with, though, is when we look at presidents, because there's only one, we expect the president to do a lot. And if he doesn't deliver, he gets the blame. If you look at Obama's approval ratings throughout his presidency, they have gone down over time. Now, one explanation might be that people genuinely don't like the things that he's signed into law. But he also hasn't had a lot of opportunity to sign things into law. So another explanation could be that they expected him to make a lot of laws or sign a lot of bills into law, and he has been unable to. So normal times, he has to deal with checks and balances. This leads to the problem. We expect so much of the president, but we place a number of obstacles in his path. One way to look at the power of the president and how it's grown over time is basically to recognize that the president's ability to be seen and heard by the American public has grown due to media. That was a big change. And so today, we recognize that the power of the president is great, and I would focus on FDR as the person who starts that off. And there are a lot of problems out there also, so we expect the president to try to solve these problems. We're now going to look at how we try to keep the president from becoming a dictator. There are obviously the traditional constitutional checks. Even if the president vetoes legislation, the House and the Senate can override a presidential veto with a 2/3 vote. In addition, the president may nominate people for positions, but the Senate has to confirm them. And then you've got the courts, and the courts can declare executive orders, executive actions to be unconstitutional. They can strike down things that the president tries to do. But the real focus of this today is on what I'd like to call the new checks, the new things that have happened that really kind of limit the president. And we start with congressional leaders, and this will go right to what is about to become the 114th Congress. Actually, when you hear this, it'll be the 114th Congress. And what we will find in the 114th Congress is that the president of the Senate will still be Joe Biden because he's vice president, but you will have Orrin Hatch, a Republican, be the president pro tempore, And then the majority leader will be Mitch McConnell, a Republican. John Cornyn will be the majority whip. So the Republicans basically will control everything in the Senate as best they can. Remember, in the Senate, the minority party still does have some power. In the House, once again, it will be John Boehner as the Speaker of the House with his Republican leadership there. The minority party, the Democrats, basically will not be able to do much. So congressional leaders can definitely place a check on the president because he's not going to be able to do much unless they send it to him. Another issue that can be a problem for presidents are cabinet members. And what I mean by this is that when you appoint somebody to be in your cabinet, and you can see we have a current list of these cabinet members, when you appoint people to be there, they are confirmed by the Senate, and then they leave and go work in a different building. They actually go to the Pentagon, or they go to the Justice Department. And when they're there, they're going to preside over a bunch of people who have worked there for years and years and years. A famous example where this became a problem was when Jimmy Carter was president, and he appointed a guy by the name of James Cafilano to be his secretary of department, was called at the time Health, Education, and Welfare. And they ran into major obstacles. Cafilano came out publicly and said, tobacco kills people, you should not smoke. Jimmy Carter, who was hoping to be reelected as president, and in order to be reelected would need to win places like North Carolina, which were large tobacco producers, Jimmy Carter said, our goal is to make tobacco safer than it already is today. Well, when the person who is in charge of health, education, and welfare says tobacco kills and we should do everything we can to ban it, and the president says, wait a second, we want to make tobacco safer than it already is, it leads to a problem. So once you become a member of the cabinet, you can kind of carve your own path, and then it becomes kind of embarrassing if the president has to step in and say, all right, you're fired because I don't like your message. Not because you're incompetent, but I don't like your message. Our next part is that term we use a lot, and it's called the bureaucracy. And I choose the IRS for this because they have an amazing amount of power. The IRS is its own bureaucratic agency, and in many ways, they help write the tax code. They help determine whether or not people violated the tax code, and if you did, they will determine the punishment for you violating the tax code. For example, a friend of mine just recently was talking about how they got a letter from the IRS saying that they owed back money for a business that they had started that they had not paid taxes on. Well, the reality is they ran the business for a year and then officially closed it down. At least they thought they had officially closed it down. And it turned out paperwork had not been submitted. So according to government, that business was operating the last 3 years and owed taxes for its operation over those 3 years. The reality is that business was not an operation. So now they have to go through hearings and hopefully can convince the IRS that they should not have to pay penalties. Bureaucratic agencies today have amazing amounts of power because they have the discretion to determine what the law means and whether or not you violated it. That's a lot of power. Our next one, obviously, are political parties. And this is one of my favorite examples. We've looked at a lot of different committees in both the House and the Senate, but the Senate Budget Committee is the best example I can think of dysfunction because they cannot even agree on a single website. So literally you get the Democratic, and this is as of today, majority website or the Republican minority website. Those will switch by the time we get together. But their view of the budget and how money should be spent is so different, they cannot even agree on a website. The political parties and the polarization that the parties cause obviously will make it difficult for presidents to achieve policy. Our next one, and one we've spoken a lot about, interest groups. And I just wanted to give you a quick example. This was just an alphabetical list of interest groups. And you can see as I scroll down There are a lot of different groups out here, and all of them have members, and most of them have significant resources. We've looked at some of these already. The National Rifle Association, we've seen. The Chamber of Commerce, we've definitely looked at. We talked about PETA before. So there, the National Right to Life Committee. So there's going to be a lot of different groups here, and those groups will try to influence members of Congress, and those members of Congress will then determine what they will or will not do, and that could very much go against the president. Oh, a couple others, my people, AARP, and another one that I've mentioned to you before, the AFL-CIO. So these are big interest groups that definitely influence policy. Our next is one that we've had to deal a lot with, and this is called adversarial journalism. It used to be that if there was going to be a show and they were going to invite people on to discuss issues, you would have a civil conversation. This was from 2005. They were talking about an old show called Crossfire. And basically, what the two people, one conservative and one liberal, did is they kind of yelled at each other. That was basically what they did. But the yelling was emotional and not factual. And that becomes the issue with adversarial journalism, that you're attacking each other, not having a deep debate about factual information, about policy. Today, and this was just an example of it, and this was a while ago, but Sean Hannity, Bill O'Reilly, this show's off the air now, but it was Countdown with Keith Olbermann, Glenn Beck, Rush Limbaugh, Rachel Maddow. A bunch of these are still on the air, and they are adversarial. When someone from a different point of view comes on the air, they tend to be attacked. One of the things I hope you will always look at if you watch one of the partisan networks, whether it be MSNBC or Fox, look at the quality of person they bring on from the other side. Does the person have really good credentials? Is the person articulate? There are many times where I will see people brought onto networks and they can barely speak. They do not have a conscious thought or a collective thought at all. So I encourage you to look at the quality of people that are brought on. But adversarial journalism builds up hatred. And when you build up hatred, it makes it really difficult for presidents to, to operate. Fox, I would say very safely, has not been a friend of President Obama. MSNBC was definitely not a friend of George W. Bush. And if you watch one of those networks, your thought process for the president is bad, ineffective, almost criminal, should be impeached. And if that's all you can think about, you're not going to focus on policy, or your default will be to oppose any policy which the president proposes. Next, excuse me, we have what's called an independent counsel, and this has been used a couple of times. It was used back when Nixon was president to investigate Watergate, and it was used when Bill Clinton was president, when a man by the name of Ken Starr did a massive investigation about President Clinton, and it was looking into his background with what was called the Whitewater affair, and then it also wound up going into the Monica Lewinsky affair. Now, I'm not going to go through all of this. You can go through, but I can say a lot of it is actually quite graphic. But the point to this is, if you're being investigated by an independent counsel, it takes away from the president's ability to do his job. And there's always that air of suspicion hanging over the president's head, because why would there be a need for an independent counsel if you hadn't done something wrong? And if that's how you look at your president, do you trust that person to be a good leader? So again, I think that becomes a check on the president. Our next one, we're going to take a moment on this, are the different things that senators in particular can use to try to prevent a president from getting his people in place. This was a very nice explanation from WiseGeek about what's called senatorial courtesy. And basically, and please make sure you understand this, this is not in the Constitution. It is another one of those Senate practices. It's something that senators traditionally have done. And what it says is that if there is a federal judgeship that is open in your state, and the president gets to nominate people for that federal judgeship, that you as an individual senator should have the ability to say either yay or nay, because that person will be on the bench for the rest of his or her life in your state. And this is called senatorial courtesy. You're not necessarily supposed to do this because you don't like the person or just because they're an opposite party, but you have genuine objections to who they are or what their philosophy is or whether they're competent or not. So senatorial courtesy is a long-standing practice that has been in the Senate. The next one is what you see as a hold, because what happens is if you can't just stop the person from getting the position, you can then place a hold on their nomination, and I'll give you an example of one of those in a moment. Next, we're going to go to filibusters, and this was an interesting piece. During President Obama's presidency, and this goes through November of 2013, you can see the date. President Obama has had an opportunity to nominate a lot of people to both the courts and to different executive branch agencies. And I did research this. This is a factual statement. During his term as president, uh, 82 of the nominees that he has put forth have actually been filibustered, that have been blocked by opposition party, by the Republicans in the Senate. In the rest of history combined, 86 filibusters took place for all other presidents combined. And so this was obviously an ad trying to argue for changing the process, and Democrats actually did change the process the last 2 years. But this is an amazing power in the Senate, because if one senator doesn't want to do something, or if you can get at least 41 senators to agree, then you can stop the majority party from doing things unless you can break that filibuster vote with 60. So the ability of the Senate to filibuster, or senators to filibuster, is an amazing power in the Senate. Our next one was just another example of this, and it was about a person this time, and it was about an executive agency. This went back to 2009, but I thought it was very good for you to see the phrase here. Senator Jim DeMint, who's no longer in the Senate, but he was a Republican from South Carolina, held up President Obama's nominee to lead the Transportation Security Administration, despite a recent airline bombing plot on Christmas Day. I don't know if you remember this. It's the guy that tried to have like an explosive device in his underwear. Got to be crazy. Anyway, the reason why DeMint didn't want this guy to be the director of the Transportation Security Agency is this man supported the right of TSA workers to unionize, and DeMint thought it would be bad for the nation if the Transportation Security Administration had a labor union. So he, as a single individual, placed a hold on the nominee for the Transportation Security Administration. That's, again, an amazing amount of power for one individual, but that happens in the Senate unless you could get 60 senators to break it. And that is difficult, because even if you don't agree with what Mr. DeMint was doing here, you want to retain that power for yourself later. And if you go against him, then he will probably go against you later, and that unique power for senators will go away. Our last example here is going to go back to the holds and judicial nominees. And this was a nice little list. And what you're going to find is you've got a whole bunch of people where it says failed nominees. These were people who President Obama nominated. Oops, I didn't get the whole screen there. And I so tried this time. Here we go. Oh, that's not going to work. Oh, messing up, messing up. Oh, well. Anyway, President Obama nominated people for office, and what winds up happening is some of them just give up after a while. They wait a couple of years, and then they finally say, you know what, never mind. One of them down here, these were the successful ones. One down here was a failed one, was a woman who waited like over 2 years. I think it was here. February 2012, she was nominated, I think. Anyway, she waited a while, and finally she just gave up. And so sometimes people just say, forget it, I walk away. Sometimes they're out and out rejected. But this is, again, an amazing power in the Senate. You have all these people who would like to be guaranteed jobs, and they're not going to have that guarantee. Oh, one other one, because this one was just recent. Uh, we were talking about the Surgeon General, and he was just confirmed in December, but this was Senator Rand Paul who did place a hold on the Surgeon General's nomination. And I thought it was real interesting because this is the official way to place a hold. And you'll see it's a letter addressed to the Senate Majority Leader at the time, Harry Reid, and he was saying he has an objection to floor consideration of the nomination of Dr. Vivek Murthy to the position of Surgeon General. Here's the key with this. The committees had already said move forward. They were ready to vote for him. But he says, I have an objection to floor consideration. So he is placing a hold on this nomination until he is satisfied with the qualifications of this man, or until 60 senators would vote to break it. Now, I think in this case it was only 55 that had to break it because of the change in the rules. But if you look here, he puts in some very specific things that he has a concern about. He believes that this guy is very far to the left. He says that he comes from an organization that he doesn't agree with, and goes on to say that he is advancing stricter gun control laws and promoting the Affordable Care Act, and therefore he does not think that should be the primary policy of the Surgeon General, and he has deep concerns about this person. Now, he has the right to do this, and I wanted you to see the formal way it's done. To break it, again, you needed originally 60 senators and now 55, and we'll see what the Republicans do when they come to power in a few days. Okay, moving on, we're almost done here. Another definite block or check on the president is going to be divided government, and this one is 1900 all the way to present times. So if it's all red or all blue in all three boxes, it's unified government. And you're going to see there was a long period of time where there was unified government, and then we hit the 50s. And in the 50s, not too much. 60s was unified, 70s not, a short period in the late 70s, 80s definitely not, 90s almost exclusively not, and basically 2000s almost not. So divided government, again, has really changed how things are done. And as a result of divided government, it makes it a lot tougher for the president to get his things done. Our last piece on this, and the final one on our list, is we're in a different world. And I say a multilateral world more than a unilateral. By unilateral, and there are still some who follow unilateral, we call them neocons a lot of times. People who would say, if we see a problem in society or in the world, that we reserve the right to unilaterally act. We don't need to talk to other people about it. We're the United States. We are the leader of the free world, and if there's a problem, we'll go deal with it. But many times, presidents, both Republican and Democratic, prefer not to do that. And they will go through groups like the United Nations. They'll try to get through the Security Council. Or they'll go through NATO to try to get things done. North American Treaty Alliance. North Atlantic, sorry, Treaty Organization. Wow, I blew that one bad. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There you go. But they will go through these groups to try to achieve policy rather than going it alone. And again, that can place a limit on the president's power because those other groups will have a voice, and the voice may not always agree with what the president wanted. All right, hopefully that made sense to you, and you have lots of examples for different types of new checks on the president, and that brings this lecture to an end.